Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving straight into a seriously fascinating and honestly pretty challenging text today, all about our intellectual blind spots, the true nature of certainty, and the very real cost of pride. Specifically, we're going to unpack this concept of epistemological vices. Now, I know that sounds like a total mouthful, but stick with me, because I promise you, by the end of this, you are going to look at your daily conversations, especially your arguments, in a completely different light. We're going to map out exactly how our minds actively trick us into protecting our egos, usually right at the expense of the actual truth.
To kick things off, let's just sit with a pretty provocative question for a second. What actually happens when your absolute greatest conviction is, in reality, a blindness that you just can't see? It's kind of a chilling thought, right? I mean, we spend so much of our lives building up our certainties, gathering facts, solidifying our worldviews. But what if the very lens you're using to view the world is completely distorted and you don't even realize it? Keep that question rolling around in the back of your mind as we go through this, because it literally frames everything we're about to explore today.
Okay, let's really get into this. To understand this sort of Trojan horse inside our own minds, we've got to look at the difference between physical vices and intellectual vices. It's a huge distinction. See, if we look at physical or behavioral vices, they're usually pretty obvious to the person who has them. An alcoholic knows that they drink. A miser, someone who hoards all their money, they know they're hoarding it. But epistemological vices, intellectual vices, they're an entirely different beast. They are almost completely invisible to the person who has them. And why is that? Because the person suffering from this kind of vice genuinely believes they are just seeing reality exactly as it is. They don't think they have a bias, they think they have the absolute truth. And that invisibility? That is exactly what makes this so incredibly dangerous.
The source text actually points out a pretty incredible historical and spiritual example of this problem straight from the New Testament. Think about this. Jesus never called the religious experts of his day, the Pharisees, ignorant. He didn't say they lacked information or, hadn't read enough scrolls. He called them blind. The supreme tragedy of spiritual and intellectual blindness is that the blind person has no idea they're blind. These experts had all the information in the world at their fingertips, but they totally lacked the internal availability to actually see what was standing right in front of them.
So that raises the big question. How in the world do we know if we have this blindness? Well, the text lays out 9 distinct warning signs, and I want you to honestly audit your own everyday conversations as we run through these. Here is sign number 1. When someone disagrees with you, what is your immediate, knee-jerk gut reaction? Is it, did they see something I missed? Or is it, oh, I need to prove them wrong right now? On the surface, these might seem kind of similar, because they both involve jumping into a debate, but they actually belong to completely different universes. One is seeking the truth, the other is just seeking victory.
And that competitive mindset bleeds right into warning sign number 2. You already know what the other person is going to say before they even finish speaking. Have you ever caught yourself doing this? You interrupt, you finish their sentences for them, you mentally label them, you put them in a neat little box in your head. When we do that, our brains literally stop listening. We just start recognizing familiar patterns. The source notes that this even happens to people reading the Bible or a really familiar text. They know exactly what the verse means before they even finish reading it. Or actually, scratch that, they know their preferred interpretation of it and absolutely nothing else can get in.
Which naturally brings us to the third warning sign, and man, this one hits pretty hard. It really forces us to look at our own discomfort when we bump into something true that contradicts what we already believe. Because look, all change produces pain. But you have to ask yourself, does your pain come from your pride or from the truth? The person who genuinely loves the truth is going to suffer a bit when they discover they were wrong, sure, but ultimately they'll be thankful. The person who loves their own ego, though, they'll suffer when they find out they're wrong, and their immediate reaction will be to attack. Just let that difference sink in for a second.
All right, moving on to the fourth sign, it's all about the way we ask questions. There's just a massive difference between asking a question to learn and asking a question to win. The text contrasts the Pharisees and Jesus here. Both of them asked a ton of questions, but the Pharisees, they asked questions to trap people, to win an intellectual game. Jesus asked questions to liberate people, to really crack open their minds. So think about your own life for a minute. Did the last important question you asked actually have the power to change your own mind, or was it just totally designed to confirm what you already believed?
The source fires through the next few signs pretty quickly, so let's just summarize them. Sign 5, reading only to confirm your bias, actively ignoring anything that might actually require you to change. Sign 6, changing the subject to something technical when a conversation threatens to actually touch your heart. You see this all the time. People will debate politics or science or ancient languages for hours just to use knowledge as a hiding place from real vulnerability. And sign 7, confusing your identity with your opinion. When someone questions your idea, you feel like you, personally, are being attacked. When that happens, you no longer possess your ideas literally possess you.
And that brings us to the final 2 warning signs. Rarely saying I was wrong. The text actually calls this little 3-word phrase one of the greatest intellectual virtues you can have. Why? Because the person who can say it doesn't have to carry around the exhausting burden of defending this false image of infallibility. And finally, losing the capacity to wonder. When everything fits perfectly into your neat little system and literally nothing surprises you anymore, that familiarity kills your capacity for contemplation. The experts of Jesus' time were never surprised. Meanwhile, Jesus was out there constantly sparking wonder in anyone who is open-minded.
So you're probably wondering, how does this actually happen to us? How does pride totally take the wheel? The text outlines this chilling progression, and it uses a brilliant metaphor. It says it's like putting on glasses with a crooked lens. Right at the beginning, you notice the discomfort, but give it a few months and your brain just adapts. Then, if someone comes along and hands you the correct lens, the actual truth looks wrong to you. This is exactly how pride works. Step 1, the pride is noticed. Step 2, it adapts and just becomes part of your personality. Step 3, it deepens into your actual identity. And finally, step 4, you give it a noble name. You start calling your stubbornness conviction or firmness or faithfulness.
And here's the absolute crucial point we have to take away from this. The greatest danger in life is not simply believing a lie. We all make mistakes. That's just being human. The ultimate danger is building your identity on that lie. Because once a lie becomes your identity, abandoning that error doesn't just feel like changing your mind, it feels like a form of dying. This perfectly explains why people defend themselves and not the idea, even when a mountain of evidence is stacked against them. It's exactly what happened to those religious leaders who saw Jesus perform miracles. The evidence kept increasing, but the cost to their own ego of admitting they were wrong was just way too high.
And look, this danger just compounds over a lifetime, which makes humility incredibly urgent for all of us. When we're kids, we change our minds rapidly, right? We're total sponges. In our youth, we can still revise a lot of our beliefs without too much drama. But in our older years, our beliefs become so deeply entangled with our friendships, our professions, our reputations, our entire communities. Changing your mind later in life doesn't just mean learning a new fact. It means reorganizing your whole entire life. The emotional cost is massive. And that is exactly why humility has to be intentionally cultivated early on.
Okay, so what's the fix? What is the actual solution here? Interestingly enough, the answer is not to go out and gather more knowledge. It's about adopting a very specific posture. The text points to the biblical figure of Daniel as the ultimate example here. He was considered one of the absolute wisest men of his era, yet he had the spiritual strength and the intellectual humility to just plainly state, "I did not understand." By admitting the absolute limits of his own comprehension, he actually created the empty space required for God to teach him. He simply wasn't threatened by his own ignorance. To actually build that kind of humility into your life, the source offers a really practical daily routine, basically a way to audit your own heart. It suggests asking yourself a few questions at the end of every single day. Here's the first one to ask yourself. In what situation today did I feel the need to win an argument? Just think about that for a second. Try to pinpoint a conversation you had today where your primary goal suddenly shifted from communicating truth to simply making absolutely sure you walked away as the winner. It is a very, very humbling exercise to spot that motive in ourselves.
And here's another question from that daily audit. And honestly, the text flags this as probably the most important one of the whole bunch. Did I pray for God to confirm my ideas or to correct my perceptions? Wow. There is a vast, universe-sized difference between asking, "Hey, show me that I'm right," and humbly asking, "Please, show me where I am completely wrong." One prayer builds up the ego, the other totally dismantles the illusion.
Now, according to the source, the ultimate Christian antidote to all these epistemological vices totally reframes the entire concept of truth. In this framework, truth is not an intellectual conquest. It's not about getting all your concepts perfectly organized into a spreadsheet. Truth is an encounter with a person. As Jesus said, "I am the truth." And what that means is that knowing the truth is really about being continually confronted and transformed by someone who is infinitely larger than any theological or philosophical system we could ever possibly construct. Which naturally leads us to what the author calls the deepest test of all. If Christ showed you today that a closely held conviction of yours is wrong, would you defend that conviction or would you let it die in order to remain with Him? Just pause on that. This is the exact moment where knowledge stops serving the human ego and finally starts serving the kingdom. It's the pivotal moment we choose truth over our own comfort.
And this whole concept, it's captured absolutely perfectly by the Greek word metanoia.
Now, it's often translated simply as repentance, but it means so much more than just feeling remorse for doing something bad. It means a profound transformation of the mind, a complete and total change of perception. The source points out that Jesus starts his preaching with the word repent, because every sin, every error, always begins first as an error of perception. We view reality in a distorted way long before we ever act in a distorted way.
So this brings us to the real urgency of everything we've been talking about today. The author gives this powerful warning. When a lie wears the clothes of truth, it stops being fought and starts being protected. If you live inside an illusion long enough, that illusion eventually just starts sounding like your own voice. You completely lose the ability to distinguish between what is actually true and what your ego has merely learned to call the truth. The text strongly argues that we absolutely must let truth dismantle our false certainties before they root so deeply that we end up spending our entire lives just protecting a lie.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. If God showed you tomorrow, without any shadow of a doubt, that a beloved conviction of yours is completely wrong, what would be your very first reaction? Would it be joy that you are finally closer to the truth? Or would it be a desperate panic to find an argument to preserve your old position? How you answer that question tells you pretty much everything you need to know about your spiritual and intellectual health. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Stay curious, stay humble, and I'll see you all next time.